Hello, this is Arne Koets from the Kemenate in Roden, and today we are in the armory. Now, why we are in the armory is because I wanted to, test my new microphone setup in the hope that it actually finally works, but might as well talk something about horse armor. So, as somebody might have figured out, we just got this horse armor sorted out, and we got it all set up here on this particular horse mannequin. And horse armors are kind of sort of famously associated with knights on horseback. And this is kind of weird because by far and away, most complete steel horse bards for the whole horse are not medieval. They're significantly later. They're sort of early 16th century really, or first half generally, but they go on for quite a bit. Now, bards from the Middle Ages, there are not as many left. And in fact, there's very few, and most of them are incomplete. But we have the descriptions and depictions of original bards. Now, it has to be said that a lot of these drawings quite often just show a horse being protected. And what is very interesting to see is that, in fact, most of the time the chafron and crinet, which is this neck protection, is very often shown to be steel. However, the patral, the chest protection, and the crupper, which is protecting the back of the horse, very, very often is probably leather. Now, this is a bit difficult to sometimes establish when you are looking at a drawing, if that is a color. Is that just colored steel? Is it covered in cloth? Sometimes you can quite clearly see cloth markings on there. Or is it leather that is gessoed and painted or covered in cloth, which there is originals of. The other thing that we usually assume is that when you see hinges like this and all these rivets, then we assume it's steel. If you see laces, then we usually assume it is leather. However, there's examples of laced steel armor, not very many, but they are around. But the assumption is not that daft, I must say. So a lot of the time the leather body protection is what we see, and the steel body protection is far less common. However, we do see it. There's of course one in Vienna, which is one of the earliest ones that is still around. And then this one is based on the 821 suit. Now, when I say that, the 821 is in the Wallace collection, which is sort of their main medieval armor. The most famous one, mostly. And it's just quite impressive, but also because of the display. However, what we actually try to copy is the patral and the crupper. But we've added a bit. I'll get to that in a moment. However, the chamfron and crinet are actually based on an example in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that is a chamfron and crinet made by a particular master that marks his pieces with rom. It's R-O-M, R-O-M. The point being that this is actually the same master as the pauldrons on my armor were based on. So there is an example in Glasgow where one of these pauldrons, and you can see it sort of here, it's a sort of bat-wing pauldron, as they're called, with a reinforce on the front. The basis for that was an original in Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow, and that is also struck with the Rom mark, which is why I went for this particular chamfron and crinet. However, that chamfron and crinet is just a piece, chamfron and crinet. What we don't have is the rest of the bard, if there ever was one. It might have, for instance, have been originally worn with leather armor. We don't know that. But the idea was to actually make a steel bard. The idea is also to actually try to make a leather bard in future, but we've not done that yet. A friend of mine has mocked one up, I would like to say, which this horse has actually also gone under when I could borrow it for a moment, which was very nice of him. But that is a leather bard. Now, the thing with leather is that it is soft and somewhat flexy, even though the leather that they used was made rather stiff by means of all sorts of things that they do with it, but in particular gesso. So gesso is a finish which is a combination of chalk and glue and various other things they throw into the chalk and glue. This might include, for instance, shards of glass or pieces of iron ore can sometimes be part of gesso in order to particularly make protective things stronger, like shields, for instance. Now, those armors are still more flexy. So when you look at a bard, the horse needs to be able to move its legs. Now this particular horse mannequin ended up a tiny bit wider than it was intended, so it doesn't quite fit the armor, which fits the actual living horse. So as a result, it doesn't sit quite on the shoulder here. However, this edge down here, the horse could very well be beating its own legs up to this edge. And in doing so, it could very well injure itself. So having a leather edge to slam into is really quite different to a steel edge to slam into. Hence, we were quite careful to note that the original has rivets right at the tips of the steel. And this presumably was holding a leather support band for the lining, but that leather could then also extend and protect against hitting the edge of the steel. Now, these fringes are very typical for the period. We see them depicted, especially in the 16th century, but we also see them in the 15th century. Fringes were used for all sorts of things. Baldachins over the throne of a nobleman or a prince. We also see them over beds, for instance, or on the edges of a banner. Like, for instance, that banner. That is a banner that is heraldic, so it's for a banneret. So that is a higher tier of knight, and you see that it has fringes on the sides. Now, a knight's bachelor might have a banner more like this, with the point still sticking out. And there is some talk of that they actually ceremoniously would cut this point off if he got promoted. And then, of course, you got a new banner made, which was far larger. However, it would be square, hence a banneret. And you see those fringes cropping up everywhere in 15th century art in general, and thereby also in the depictions of said art. So, we see that this petrol is made out of steel. Now, these steel bards are not actually generally all that thick. There are quite differing weights and quite differing thicknesses, therefore. However, they are sort of a millimeter thick in this particular case. So that is not as thick as, for instance, the breastplate or helmet of the armor for the man. And this is because it just needs to cover so much more area, and thereby you don't want to encumber the horse too much. But it does have important reinforcements. For instance, this rondelle on the forehead of the horse. This is a very important area that is very often reinforced or made thicker, but nearly always is reinforced in some way. There's also later chaffrons, horse helmets, that don't even have the nose protected, but they have the forehead of the horse protected. And this is done for a very specific reason. Sometimes you can detach the nose, for instance. But that's a later development. But the whole point is that they are really clearly protecting the top of the forehead of the horse. In fact, these rondelles are sometimes seen in art purely by themselves attached to the bridle. And this has a very specific reason. And we read in Pietromonte in 1497, 1495, I don't remember, that when you ride at an opponent's horse, you could try and kill it with your warhammer by hitting it exactly there. And this is also where, of course, you would slaughter bigger animals. So at the time, of course, they didn't have electric shocks to work with like we do today. And if you want to kill a cow for slaughter, you would poleaxe it. And you would hit it exactly there with one of these hammers, with a poleaxe or a warhammer-like implement. So this was very well known by the people at the time in order to know how to humanely kill in order to slaughter, and thereby also how to drop a horse immediately. So the most obvious place to do that is directly in the skull. So this means that you end up with this very small area where you would have to hit them. And this is exactly which is reinforced extra on these chaffrons. So just putting a chaffron on a horse already makes the horse significantly harder to immediately kill. Because a horse is a vulnerable animal, it is very easy to hurt. It is also sort of easy to hurt to the point where it might not survive the night or the week. However, killing it outright is really rather hard. And of course, armor is there to prevent this from happening. So thereby it is designed to specifically focus on specific inroads into the animal of damage. And the forehead is a very important part of that. Now this might mean that the crenette is actually not that important. It is a very difficult thing to make. So this whole neck articulation needs to work, and the horse needs to move its neck in quite a large degree of motion in order to be able to move correctly and to do everything it needs to do. So it's very difficult to get that to work. And they're also sort of heavy. So for what it is probably the heaviest part of the armor, even though it's made out of the same thickness of steel. There's lots more overlap, there's lots more faff going on, lots more leather straps and so forth. A bit of mail. So that actually, for the size that it seems to be, it is actually quite heavy. It's also quite large. So it's one of the most commonly omitted parts of the full bard. This is all modular, just like the armor for the man. You might choose to not bother to wear some of it. The most likely one would be normally the chafron or the rondelle by itself. However, sometimes we actually see leather bards on the horse and nothing on the head and neck. And this is actually perhaps more common than you might normally think. And this has something to do with the effort of putting it on. So putting a chafron on needs to be done when you're ready, but a leather bard might need to be put on earlier still, because it's something you do before you ride off. Putting the bard on is a little bit of a faff, so it needs to be done in advance before the engagement. So you might not have gotten round to putting the last bits on, which is the head and neck protection, and thereby ride off with just the barding. I presume that's why, but in particular in Italy, they seem to not always wear chamfron crenettes or no chamfrons at all. This might also just be down to horses not liking it. It is much more likely that a horse has an issue with a crenette, or with a chafron for that matter, than with the barding. So, then we come to the petrel. The petrel, there is quite a few petrels that have small reinforcements around here, or around this part here, especially on these early ones. And this particular armor is a little bit distinct in that it has these bosses in the actual place where the shoulder of the horse would actually be allowed to move. A lot of these bosses on the armor are seen all over the place for horse armors, but not all of them have it. And the thing is that sometimes they're sitting somewhere over here, where not a single horse that would ever fit in that armor would have anywhere near his bow joint at all. And there is also depictions where there's more bosses than shoulders. So as a result, we end up with this rather special situation where this boss is actually there to allow freedom for the shoulder. And this is because of this point here. Not all horse armors have this. And the 821 is quite distinct in that it comes down like this. Now, because the bosses normally would sit on this shoulder joint, and of course the mannequin has just ended up too large, as a result, this doesn't move so much. And that means that because it has this little flare here, and that pointy bit down, this is actually sticking down over the sternum of the horse quite well, whilst still coming relatively high up. So this armor, for horse armor standards, is relatively tall, but not only that, it is also kind of really close to the animal. So some of the later bards come out more. It's not just later bards. I've heard it suggested that this was something that armorers couldn't do in the 14th and 15th centuries. I think if you ask an armorer, they blink at you and go, I beg your pardon. Because of course making such a big trumpet shape would be a piece of cake for an armorer. The question is whether or not they wanted that shape in that particular design. And the thing is that having this point further down does add protection, especially against hand weapons. However, it becomes this issue with this edge of the armor towards the horse's legs. So this is actually a really tricky thing to make and make work. So if you're going to make them more en masse, if you will, if you're going to make a lot that you're going to hand out to people or not necessarily going to go on a specific horse, it makes sense to err towards these flaring motions where if the horse bashes its leg against it, it bashes against the flat as opposed to against the edge. And that of course makes a massive difference to the animal. However, then it might just bash the bottom of the petrel up to a far larger degree, which means that an infantryman might be able to attack the horse with his weapon around the chest. However, when you attack it around here in the horse, this is a very bony part. There's a very deep bone structure in the form of the sternum. The sternum of a horse is really quite a lot more substantial than that of a human being. And again, people at the time were quite aware on how to kill fairly large animals. For instance, in hunting, which is specifically mentioned to be a good training for war, because if a tournament teaches a man how to strike down upon a helmet, how much better will he learn by striking down a boar? So they're specifically talking about hand weapons on dangerous large game like boar and deer. And a deer, when you get close, is really rather dangerous and sort of in the same ballpark of size as a horse. And what we see is that they specifically attack certain areas, and with deer in particular, you would try to stab them about here in the hope to get to the heart, at least in the chest cavity anyway. And it's this particular angle that we see pole weapons being used on horses in the sources as well in war. So they very clearly use the same techniques to kill game as they do to kill horses. And this particular area is very much protected by an armor like this. Now, one of the things that the mannequin doesn't have yet is a bit. You have to bear in mind that the bit is also a piece of steel. Now, especially when the horse has its head relatively close, it's collected and it's up like this, the bit is not actually that far away. And especially when the curb chain is not necessarily very tight, there might be some degree of leeway how much it moves over. And in how it is actually angled might be specific to the horse's tendencies. And this is a very important part of bitting horses in the period. Now, once the bit is slightly like this anyway, what actually starts happening is that the end of the bit is quite close to the horse's chest. So if somebody were to try and take some sharp implement and try to slice my horse's throat, the bit would literally be in the way. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be very nice to the horse. I'm sure he would not appreciate it very much. However, it might save its life regardless by just happening to be there. You also see, especially later on, that on the throat latch of the horse, so the attachment for the bridle around here, there's quite often quite significant decorations that are being put on, especially in Oriental cultures early on, and then that gets more and more adopted also in the Napoleonic period and so forth. And quite often they have little crescents and lots of metal danglies down here. They can be quite substantial, and this again protects the throat against slashing, sabers and whatnot. So even in that sense, the actual forehead of the horse might be to some degree in front of its own throat in the form of the chevron again. So actually getting towards the vitals of the horse from the front, specifically from the front, is very much impeded by this armor. You could of course attack the legs, but especially from the front, well, it will injure the horse, it will hurt the horse, absolutely, but it's not going to stop it from stomping right over you, which is your main concern when you're being attacked by cavalry. So actually riding on top and over people is specifically mentioned. Again, Pietromonti says if your armor is good enough, you could just lie on the ground and let him stomp right over you and stab the horse in the belly, but people don't generally do that, oddly. And of course, having actually ended up on one particular occasion underneath a horse in this very armor, I can say yes, Pietromonti is right. It will protect you quite well. But it's not something I would care to repeat. And I don't think anybody concerned, including the horses, would care to repeat it either, unfortunately. So then we go a little bit backwards, and now one of the things that's not on here is a so-called Flan Shard, which is right here in this area. Now this is quite an important part of the horse to protect, because this is another one of these inroads where you might be able to stab towards the vitals of the horse. However, as you see, the horse's flanks are somewhat protected by the actual leg of the rider, which of course in this case is also armored. However, flan shards are very much a thing where there's plates here. By far and away in this period, we see those flan shards being used on depictions of it being ridden as an ensemble far more when they're made out of leather. So when all of this is leather, including the Flan Shard, they're far more likely to be depicted. Not exclusive, but far more likely. The steel bars very often don't have these Flan Shards depicted. Now, they might have even made them, but not used them. In the sense of, it's a set of modular parts that you might or might not use, similar to your armor itself. You might have a different helmet for jousting, for instance, that you obviously would not wear in war. Or would you? Would you not wear a frog mouth in war? It's rather sturdy. Well, anyway, we assume they don't, usually. And anyway, so the Flan Shard is missing from this example. Now, and the question was that, and I spoke to Dr. Tobias Capel quite at length about this armor in the last few months, where I asked him, so, okay, everywhere in the catalogues, it's assumed that these Flan Shards are just missing from the original. Why do we assume that? Is this because there's attachment points, there might be buckles behind it that I never saw because, you know, when it's set up and photographed you might not see it. But of course they published photographs of the inside and I couldn't find any buckles, but maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm missing the rivet hole where the buckle would have been, or the little scratch that belies its existence. So Dr. Capel was kind enough to specifically have a look. And it turns out, no, there is no real evidence of any Flan Shards having been there. However, they might have just been attached to the saddle and just dangling by themselves. However, when you're riding one of these, as the horse bends, this petrol moves around, or the horse moves with it. And so does the crupper. So when the horse bends, and this horse is now bent to the left, and that means that the petrol and the crupper are coming quite close together. So you will actually feel, I actually ended up feeling it more on my shin when I was actually sitting on the horse. You actually feel the crupper on your body, and you feel the crupper as well as the petrol. And you feel this on your leg as well. This horse is ever so slightly larger than the actual horse that the armor was made for, but not by much, and in very specific places. In a lot of places it's actually really rather close. So what we see here is that the horse is in a very collected position. So this is a movement which is generally known as a mésère or a terre-à-terre, which is very, very important in contemporary mounted combat. It cannot be assumed without really that it's such a core movement. Not that they always did it the entire time, of course, but it was something that people were very much expected to be able to have in their repertoire, and it's part of the fencing on horseback and the fighting with lances and hand weapons on horseback, in armor in particular. And that means that when the horse is collected, the front is up, as you can see, and the neck is nicely crested, but the wither is in particular clearly higher than the rest of the horse. Now this is standing on a little bit of a step, so it's a little bit higher, but it really would be impressive even if I would stand on this step, for instance. So there we go. Now I'm at the same height, and you see that horse is really quite high. I mean, I wouldn't want it to go and step on my toes now. However, the croup, the back of the horse, is clearly down. So when you look at the horse's legs, they are zigzagged together very much in a sort of a seesaw fashion. And this is known as Haunchesflexion, or Hankenbiegung in German. And this is another second important part of what collection means. But all of this means that the pelvis of the horse is under it. So why is all this important? Because it makes the horse shorter, quite noticeably. So especially when you use this armor, you notice that the plates come closer together. Even when the horse is standing and rest, there's a noticeable distance, and then when the horse collects and bends, especially because it's bent towards the left in this case, these plates become far, far closer. So if you have a steel plate sitting underneath here and underneath the crupper plate in between, the edge is going to scrape on the inside and it's going to get in the way. So making a steel Flan Shard with steel petrol and crupper is significantly more complicated than having a leather one that can do a little bit of a flexi. And there is even ones with hinges in here for that reason. Now, the other thing is that they're just annoying. If you're riding with a plate under your leg, that's just annoying to give aids. And this comes to another thing that is quite annoying when you're riding with one of these, is that your reins would be lying around here on the neck, and the actual pressure of the rein on the neck, or the touch, is a very important way of riding one-handed. So you don't just ride with a bit directly affecting the horse. You ride with the reins so-called indirectly affecting the neck of the horse. Now this neck armour here, the crenette, actually sort of gets in the way of that. So to some degree you might lose a little bit of influence from the reins. And then of course you could try and ride more from the bit itself, but this is very limited, especially when you try to turn, which is so core to mounted combat. Hence you really do need your legs. So especially when you're trying to ride into battle, you probably would leave the Flan Shards off, even though it does give an inroad for the infantry. So this comes to the main idea of, oh, but I would just cut at its legs. Just is a very interesting word. First of all, they move rather fast, but also when I'm cutting at the front of the legs, I might be there for a while. So I would definitely very grievously hurt the horse, but it would be very, very difficult to actually hurt it to a degree that it would stop killing me. And thereby using it at the back of the legs is a very different proposition. This is where a horse is very, very vulnerable. And of course, especially also at the back of the hind legs. Now, in order to come down here, provided the gentleman up there has noticed me, means that he has a lot of opportunities to hit me with his sword, his lance, the back of his lance in my face. I need to get here to get there. The horse might kick me, which with this kind of a horseshoe really wouldn't be very nice, and there's worse or more evil ones. It might bite me on the way there, and they were encouraged to do so. But also the rider might literally just dump this horse on top of me as it makes this turn. So I never get there to even attack the horse's legs. The other thing is that once the blood is up, so to speak, it is actually remarkably difficult when you're up here and there's this thing in the way to actually get down and have a good old strike at a horse's leg. And you do need a bit of force with your weapon, just touching it won't do. So what you see is that the actual extension of these plates a little bit off actually already gives to some degree protection. Also falling short of arrows. Now, and then we get to this particular dragon on the back. Now we say dragon because quite often these are all very dragon-esque. Whether or not this is depicting a dragon, I suppose you could argue, but it's probably one because nearly all of the other contemporary artwork is doing dragons for actually several generations. So there is no dragon like this on the A21 suit. So this is something we just added. However, you could just literally undo it and just ride without it, and then you would just have cross straps, which is definitely seen. Usually with a little bell right there. However, I wanted to try this for the simple reason that I wanted to know how it worked. And this one is shown as a Maximilian depiction. So probably a generation later, but it was the simplest dragon that I could find. That was a dragon which has this nice sort of tail finial. The one in the Royal Armories has a far more complicated dragon, which looks remarkably medieval. It's a bit, retarded. However, it is much more complicated to make, so I didn't want to force the armourer to make one, since it was all a bit of a jolly anyway. So we just made this particular version just to try it out. Now, probably this is a bit later, I must say, but it gives some idea of something that might have been used anyway. A feature would have been there. Now, the thing is, do you need this bit? Because when is somebody going to attack you from here? What you need, for instance, if you come from the front, when you're being attacked from the front, you might have lances coming your way, you might have people that you are attacking. But also, for instance, if you're being shot at, by and large, shot might be coming from the front. That is the assumption, at least, that we are facing our enemies. So then we're having it come in at some sort of angle. Now, that depends a little bit on how much the archers are waiting for the last moment to shoot. Now, this is a discussion by itself, because quite often we know that they had the tactic of hiding behind the man-at-arms. And when thousands of people need to hide behind thousands of other people, this takes time. And if you leave corridors for them to run through, that means that the cohesion of the other unit that's supposed to protect you has just been compromised and it has to be decompromised again. And that takes time. So if the cavalry is only 20 yards away when you lose your last shot, that means you're fighting them and not the other people. So quite a lot of the time we know that they shot at relatively long distance and then scarpered. We really do know that that has happened on specific occasions where it didn't on other specific occasions. But that does mean that a large part of the arrows that you might be protecting your horse against are coming in at some angle, which again means that these various pieces of armor are designed to cover that. And you might very well have arrows coming in here. However, if they're coming straight for your horse's back, the rider itself is actually in the way of this arrow coming in. And that means that the rider actually has a piece of a shadow, which means that basically that particular dragon piece of armor might not be particularly often used. If I am the unlucky rider on the side of a cavalry unit, that might be shot at in the flank by archers in a tactically not preferred situation, there is only really one or two horses on the side that they can actually do so, because whatever next horse is there is well covered by this horse. So then you still have this massive plate here which protects against a great deal of arrows from the side, and again the dragon doesn't make that much of a difference. It kind of completes the overall coverage, but it probably isn't quite so core, and thereby it's kind of modular. The question is how much it would have been used as such. So again, steel bards are fairly uncommon, and weirdly enough there is a lot of the hinges of the original pieces from this sort of late 15th century period on the original German bards are all really rather similar. They have the heart shapes and stuff. They're not the same, but they're rather similar. One set in particular is probably a reproduction or a reconstruction on the basis of the other ones. We don't know that for absolute sure though. And the thing is that these ones, they're so similar, almost as though there was one particular workshop that made the hinges. But can we say that? Are they that similar? Good question, glad you asked. The point being that it might very well be that there was only a fairly small region where these horse armors were made and that they were literally all buying their hinges from the same guy. We don't know that, but it's an interesting little thing to have a further look at. So steel bards are definitely shown in art, they definitely crop up, but by far and away the body protection of the horse is mostly leather. Up to 1 centimeter thick if I'm not mistaken. I haven't measured the particular original that was reported to be 1 centimeter thick. I should check that more precisely, but really rather substantial. Which also might mean that leather bards are not necessarily much lighter than the steel bards. So we'll talk a bit more about weights in a further video. I'm sure we'll have plenty of videos to make about bards, but this is actually quite doable. So including the whole armor, myself in the armor, the sword, the lance, that particular shield, which is a very German shield. This is a shield that was set up for war, so it might be used for a joust of war, yes, but it's essentially a war shield. And we see that it has this particular protection here because there's no vam plate on the lance. That would be a jousting thing. That would be very annoying in campaign. So as a result, you very quickly control the lance of your opponent into your hand like this. And this is why this particular area is sticking out and protecting your hand. And this cutout or bouche, like it means mouth, or this particular type of shield known as an écranche, or I was told they were supposed to say écranché, but I'm not sure. Anyway, that means the cut out shield. And this particular type of shield has very spiky designs in German 15th century in particular. And you see these massive ridges. Now the thing is that these things are quite thick in the middle and then they taper quite a lot. But this is quite a substantial piece of protection as well. So both man and rider are really quite protected, and the obvious holes in the armor, like the groin, would be protected by the shield, the saddle itself, and the shield is protecting both armpits, which are the quintessential place to attack a man in armor. The wrists are completely protected, not just by the gauntlet, but also the inside of the wrist, which is something you might attack on foot. The actual shield might be worn a little bit higher when they're not trying to strike low, and that actually protects all the way up to the face, and you can actually hang it up there. I normally have it hung up so I can't get in between the bever and the salets visor. And that means that this will actually protect also your visor getting knocked around. Now this particular helmet is a closed salet, but you do of course have a salet here with a separate bever, and you could in theory get in between here. So very similar helmet, set up a bit wonky, but so you see that this is really protecting quite a lot. So you're left with very little. So I suppose from the back here I could start getting up here, but even there would be some mail protection or perhaps even a plate collar. But getting up here is really rather difficult because I couldn't possibly do that from the front. I mean, already from about, even with a long pole weapon, this is still covered. Now I would miss his neck. I might hit the helmet, but that's about, I would have to get further. So it's beyond 90 degrees before I can start attacking the neck of the rider. So what I'm left with to attack the rider, where I wouldn't need to go straight through his armor, is literally his vision slit. So it is in fact something that you can it's very difficult to kill the horse, it's very difficult to kill the rider. So as of large, you can basically try to just ride over people, which they specifically did. Now of course this is by no means infallible. Obviously there were very many people trying very, very hard to find ways to deal with such a proposition of being charged by cavalry, but especially when you're not in a prepared position, this obviously was a problem. There's big disadvantages. You need to put all this stuff on the man, on the horse, so it becomes a logistical nightmare to get this in the field, but if you do, it kind of works. Now, the two things that probably everybody wanted to know as the things I haven't mentioned, which is the date of this thing. Yeah, that's a good question. Because the chamfer and creenet, and especially the bard, is probably 1480. The armor of the man is, for a large part, slightly earlier, but sort of butting up to 1480, especially with some exchange pieces. The shield would work, so I'm going to say 1480. Let's assume that the armor was already extant for the rider and that he got a couple of extra bits and pieces, and then the horse armor in the 1480s. Probably, I would say Low Countries, Lower Germany, somebody who would be buying off people who are making Germanic armor. Yet we see this kind of outfit specifically mentioned in Burgundian context as well. Now there are a lot of people from the German lands that were under Burgundian rule that thereby ended up in Burgundian armies. So it's that sort of ballpark. Almost like, I don't know, a Dutch guy in, say, the Jonker Fransenoorlog. I don't know, just as a random example. That might just barely sort of work out. But it is a little bit of a mismatch, I will admit. But then again, some of these things happen. It's not that they're out of sync with each other or out of style with each other, but there is some degree of it having been assumed to be accrued over the space of 20 years or so. Now, then as to the weight, the arms and armor of the rider, including the shield itself, are roughly 25 kilos, including the mail. And the undergarments, to the shoes and the spurs and everything. Then the horse bard is about 22 kilos in this complete setup. So you could delete bits, as I've said, like the dragon. So that might be the setup we're really thinking about is more like 20 kilos or so. This is very similar to the original pieces in that when the pieces were in the same state as the originals, they were basically the same weight. It's just that we've had to add the missing bits, like the lining, which has added a little bit of weight. So, yeah, and leather, actually. Leather makes a lot of difference. I don't think it's the fringes. Do you think it's the fringes that were that heavy? Oh, I don't know. Anyway, so, yeah, first introduction in a little bit of a jolly about a horse armor, trying out my new microphone, and I hope you can this time actually hear me. So if so, we'll make more of these to keep on yapping on about stuff, about horses and armor and martial arts. So, thank you very much.